Welcome back to Sephardic U Presents, our weekly podcast. This week we're talking about Parashat Beshalach, which is the crossing of the Red Sea. In Parashat Beshalach, Pharaoh changes his mind and chases after the Israelite people with his army, trapping them at the Sea of Reeds. And we have a number of key events here. The song of the sea, the provision of manna, the bitter water made sweet, and the relevance of, we'll talk about the relevance of today. And joining me as always is my co-host, Sam Bendayan. Let's get it started.
Oh, all right, let's do it. So this parasha, I guess, it starts with what is arguably the most famous occurrence in the entire Torah, which is the splitting of the Red Sea.
Yeah.
Famous story worldwide, and it's a unbelievable parasha with a lot of very very interesting insight. You might say psychological insight as to the state of mind of the Jewish people. And obviously, there's lots of, once they cross the sea and everybody's extremely happy and they're singing and everything. And then soon after, they start to have the problems that you would expect to have in a desert, right? There's no food, there's no water. And immediately you see how the uh, the people of Israel turn on
Start
Moses.
doubting.
They start doubting, they start, as the Ashkenazim say, they start kvetching, which is it's basically complaining just to complain, right?
Yeah.
You've got
Well,
right.
you're absolutely right. It's a great part. As a kid growing up, I always wondered, how did they cross the sea? And it's been the question of many. And I don't know if any of you had a chance yet, but I ran across a video today on Instagram that I shared in our WhatsApp group. And if you had a chance to see it, it was a neat explanation, not an explanation, it was kind of a discovery. So it showed a map of Egypt, and then there are two forks of the water. So there's the Nile, which is the famous Nile, which Moses was drawn from. But there's also the second one, which is, I forgot the exact name, Akaba, or something similar to that, the other branch of the river. And this is apparently the Red Sea. Well, it does have a shallow bridge that crosses it, but shallow is all relevant. It's shallow compared to the rest of it. It happens to be 900 feet deep, but there were discoveries made there at that 900-foot depth, which is the shallowest in that waterway. Consider it a bridge between the two lands that crosses the river. At 900 feet, they found chariot wheels and some other artifacts that date from the same century as would have been the crossing of the Red Sea in the Bible. And what was the thing? What was the key is the number of spokes in the wheel. So they were covered in gold, but the wood had disintegrated, and the gold was just what they called a veneer, very thin. So it's very fragile, but they found it. If you have a chance, go back and look at this video that's in our WhatsApp group. It's very, very interesting. So that's it. I'll give it back to you, Sam.
Yeah, it's that's really interesting, and it reminds me of a video I think I mentioned last week or the week before. A famous Israeli film producer, Simcha Jacobovich, I believe, he made a video on the Exodus. It's called The Exodus Decoded. And
Mm-hmm.
he provided a possible explanation for this sort of splitting of the sea. It had to do with the volcanic activity at Santorini, which apparently, according to him, happened at around the same time. And obviously, if you've got shifts in the tectonic plates, it can play
Right.
all kinds of havoc with the levels of the ocean. And and you can have these sudden kind of shifts. You can imagine if there's a shift below the ocean of plates, the water would be displaced and all kinds of chaos
Right.
can happen. So it's very interesting just to note that something like this is possible from a
Well, isn't
nature
that what
perspective.
how tsunamis are started, that
Right.
shift, and
Yeah,
there
Yes,
can
exactly.
be a drawing out of a tide, then a big push back into a tide,
Right.
which
Exactly.
could have been because how does the Torah describe it? It was an eastern wind and then a western wind. I mean, could have been a
Right.
storm.
Right.
Deanna,
And
I saw you were wanting to chime in here. Please do so.
in Rabat, I remember in Rabat, by at the time of Tisha B'Av, which was about July, the sea literally will retreat the beach. There was really no water. There was a jetty separating the beach from the ocean. And at Tisha B'Av, that week of Tisha B'Av, we could walk all the way to the jetty because the sea had completely disappeared. And we would walk all the way to the jetty on dry land.
Amazing.
So it can happen. I don't know what was, maybe it was an equinox, I don't know what it was, but for this whole week of Tisha B'Av, the beach existed no longer. We could walk all the way to the jetty.
it was for 1 week, the duration
Yes,
of it.
yes.
Very interesting. So it wasn't tides.
No, I don't know what it was, but it was the
Right.
week of Tisha B'Av. And we were told not to swim because the waters were very turbulent. But strangely, that whole beach would be dry land. It was an amazing phenomenon.
Right. And this brings to mind another very big question that people always ask. Was this a miracle or was it just some freak natural occurrence? Right.
Well,
And so, right. Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. The Torah is based on natural phenomenon. It just are amplified. The definition of a miracle is something happening at the moment you need it. These were natural occurrences. It was only the time that they occurred and the magnitude of them.
Right.
It's
And the interesting thing about this is that many times a miracle, Hashem uses nature to work miracles.
true.
Right. And a lot of people ask, well, why doesn't he just like completely avoid nature and just do something completely new? And the answer is, well, why should he do it that way? Is it because you want to see a show? Well, maybe he doesn't want to give you a show. Maybe he wants to work it through nature. He did, after all, create nature, and he decides when to use it and when to go around it. And there's an interesting story uh, that you can read about the prophet Elisha with the miracle of the oil,
Mhm,
which is very interesting because if you really look into the story, it says a lot about the nature of miracles.
mhm,
And basically, just to make a long story short, miracles are, a lot of times they will use nature as much as possible.
mhm.
However, the question becomes, if this was just a freak natural occurrence, how did Moses know exactly when it was going to happen? Right?
He does not. It is God who tells him.
Exactly. So but if, like some people might say, oh, the Israelites were just lucky. They just walked through and they happened to be there. Yeah, happened to be there at exactly the right time during which this unprecedented event occurs. And they walk across just in time. And then the Egyptians come across just in time to get swept away by the water. So I think that what's interesting is that when God does miracles through nature, it still preserves people's free will, people's ability to say, you know what? I don't think it was a miracle. I think it was something else, right? And you can doubt if you want, but you'll find that if you really look at it, it's obvious, right? There's no way that Moses could have known. And there's too much of a coincidence. And
Yeah.
so
And then
And,
we get to the manna,
Go ahead.
which is the other miracle that's presented in this parasha. The manna is clearly not natural.
Mhm.
Yeah.
yeah, it's
Rafa, I saw
It
you wanted
even
to.
calls it out. The manna is something that the Israelites had never experienced before.
right.
Thanks,
And
James. Rafa, you wanted to add something?
Yeah. To piggyback on the earlier point, I was reading in an earlier pasuk, the Ramban, Nachmanides. He talks about how Hashem favored to base the miracles upon the natural phenomena as a part of his plan to harden Paro's heart and of his followers, so they would continue to pursue the Yodim.
right.
So
And the magicians, right? The magician's ability to reproduce some
right.
of these plagues. It actually says in the Torah, when Pharaoh saw that, then he hardened his heart and he said, this is, like Yul Brynner said in the famous movie, it's a cheap magician's trick. And
But I mean, you kind of see that today, right? It's like, as science advances and people begin to rationalize, the things that happen, they put these idea of miracles on the back burner. And at the end, they say, well, this is all part of nature. This is not part of a divine plan. This is part of some, part
right.
of nature, just the natural workings. And they don't give any credit to Hashem, but that serves to kind of split the mind of, the faithful and those who are secular minded, to say, we put our faith in Hashem, not because of just miracles, but because we know that each one of these has a purpose.
That's right. So the waters part, however they did it, natural, miraculously, with the winds, with shifts, they get across, and we're now coming up on the fourth Aliyah, where I found interesting here, God locked the wheels, so the Israelites have crossed, or they're getting almost done crossing. And here come the Egyptians in pursuit, in hot pursuit with chariots. They're catching up on them. And then this is a little odd verbiage. God locked the wheels of their chariots so that they move forward with difficulty, slowing them down. And the Egyptians said, let us flee from the Israelites, for God is fighting for them against Egypt. Does anybody have thought on what that locking of the wheels is?
They got stuck in the mud. That was all. And the more they tried to extricate themselves, the more they were stuck.
That totally makes sense, because the Israelites were on foot.
Right.
Easier to walk, over wet ground. I'm assuming it's still wet because it's parted, right? So it's a soft floor, but chariot wheels, which are thin, the weight of the chariot, the weight of the Egyptian warrior in there, they're sinking. So very good.
That's a really interesting. I just thought of something that I've never thought of before, which is the weight. It was the weight of the chariots that did it.
That's right.
The human can walk across it, no problem. You put a heavy chariot with a couple of men on it with weapons, there's horses in front, the weight is a lot more, and so it sinks. So what does this mean from a spiritual perspective? The things that the Egyptians relied on, their strength, their power, their armor, their weight, that's what did them in.
Awesome analogy.
Very interesting.
Yeah. James?
Well, the verse says that the Israelites walked over the sea on dry ground.
Mm-hmm.
I think metaphorically, right?
Yeah, relatively speaking, they could walk on it.
Yeah.
Correct.
They could walk on it. It was dry enough for them to walk, in other words.
Correct. I remember in Morocco we did walk. It was soft.
Yeah.
It is not dry completely, but it is soft comparatively to the wet, to the water. Of course, the land will sound will feel dry.
Well, a little bit of comparison here, but this is more tidal. In dealing with the tides, we were traveling through New Brunswick, and there is a place called Hopewell Rocks. It's a national park now. What's its claim to fame? The highest tidal change. The tide is drawn by the moon and gravity, and that's what raises the levels of the ocean and lowers them. It has the highest tidal change in North America. You know how many feet within 12 hours it changes? 42 feet.
Wow.
So it's a national park. We went there, and there are concrete steps and stairs that you've got to go to step down. Well, when you get there, depending on what time, it was high tide, the ocean's right there. 12 hours later, we actually came back like 10 hours later, and it revealed all this staircase, concrete steps that was underwater. And what was revealed was the bottom of the ocean. So we walked on it and stepped down on it, and it was like pebble rock. So it wasn't mud, it wasn't salt. You could easily walk on it. Of course, this isn't Egypt. This is still in Canada. But ironically enough, I was brought back to this story of crossing the Red Sea in what might have been, if it were tidal. Was it a tidal change in the elevation or depth of the waters that caused it? On the same token, how did Moses hold your arms over the sea and the waters will come back, right? And drown Pharaoh's men. Well, now I'm picturing they're stuck, they're having trouble, the horses are having trouble because of the weight. And this Hopewell Rocks, every half hour, the water coming back was raising 1 foot.
Wow.
So imagine it doesn't take that long. In 3-4 hours, you're underwater, a man's height. So it was very interesting. I'm just making the analogy here. And
Actually, there's a good comment in the chat that kind of throws a bit of a monkey wrench into what we said, which is, wouldn't the Israelites also have horses and horse-drawn carts to carry their goods? Which is a good point, but
Yep.
so the difference would be the Egyptians were racing towards the Jews. The Jews are probably walking. The Egyptians were racing into it, and so obviously when you're running, the weight is amplified, right? Because you're running, and when you step down, you're stepping down with much more intensity. So I don't know. It's a good point. I don't know about
did they even
horse-drawn
have
carts.
horses and carts?
Well, they definitely had flocks. We know that, right?
The flocks they did, but not rideable,
They had cattle. They had some pretty heavy animals with them.
They do.
So,
I recall something in the skating rinks. After many skaters have been using the snow, it becomes very hard for the next team to go through that ice that has been disturbed. And that is why they come and they again put water and they allow it to freeze. I believe what Jervis said is correct. There was weight, but the fact that the chariots, which are made of bronze, are coming afterwards, after this earth has been disturbed by thousands of people, by hundreds of thousands of cattle, it becomes harder for the wheel to go through that mud that has been really disturbed.
Great points.
And the other thing is that, I think we've probably all had this happen to us at one time or another. When you step in mud, sometimes there's a phenomenon called mud sucking in English, which is you'll stick your foot in there. When you try to pull it out,
you lose your shoe.
Extremely hard because of the water, and it kind of creates a suction effect. So I wonder if that happened as well.
Correct.
And then the Egyptians said, "Oh, Hashem is fighting for them. Why? Because we're here. We can't even move. We're stuck in the mud.
Yeah,
Correct.
Maybe that's
all
what
great
happened."
points and nice observation, Jervis.
Very good observation.
We've crossed now. The Egyptians have drowned and their horses have drowned. And now we are, for time's sake, I'm trying to speed it up here a little bit. The winds change, the water's back in, and now they're grumbling because they haven't found water for 3 days. So they finally find the water, but it's bitter at Mada. They throw a piece of wood in that makes it sweet. I'm assuming it was some type of filtration, maybe that happened.
Some sap from a tree maybe that
Yeah.
reacted with the water and made it sweet. Yeah, who knows? The interesting thing about this, the episodes of grumbling that come
Mhm.
next, they all take the same form. And Moses tells them on several occasions, "You're not grumbling against me, you're grumbling against Hashem."
Mm-hmm.
So to me, what does this mean? Uh, when when you go through something like the Exodus, right? You see these things, your mind becomes elevated, right? Because you basically see miracles from Hashem. And so you see Hashem's hand very obviously in your life, and you kind of attain this sort of more elevated state where you realize something bigger is going on and there's greater forces at play. But then after that, what happened is their state of mind sank, and now all they could do was complain, but they complained at Moses, which means they were no longer seeing Hashem in the picture. All they were seeing was their man, the leader, the physical leader that they could see with their eyes, and so they complain against him. And it almost sounds like Moses is telling them, you guys remember, you need to go back up, you need to elevate again. Remember, this is Hashem
You're
behind
right.
all this. I am
You're right.
nobody.
But bad habits are hard to break, right? They've had 430 years of seeing
Especially
the
if you're
God of
thirsty
Ra.
and hungry.
Right. Add a couple days of thirst. I mean, 3 days without
As we know
water.
from the Snickers commercials, you're not you when you're hungry.
Right. And and three days of without water. I mean, I'm sure it wasn't 3 days. They probably had water, but 3 days without
Exactly.
water is not an easy thing. This is it's getting to be critical. And so
Exactly. That's what I'm thinking. They probably still had water, but they haven't found any to replenish. And we're going on day 3. The panic sets in.
yeah, they were probably just starting to ration water, and
Yep.
now they're like, what's happening, and then we see that they completely mentally break when this happens. You put a little pressure on them, they break, they forget about Hashem, they start making up fantasies about their great past in Egypt. It was so wonderful, and we had all this food. They forgot that they were being whipped, right, on a daily basis and
But
tortured and God knows what else.
but
So
they were used being slaves. They had certainly a discipline where every day they were fed, they were given this, they were given that. They were used, they were
Mm-hmm.
conditioned to a schedule. In here, suddenly the schedule is no longer there.
And being told what to do.
Exactly. Everything was predictable. Their days were predictable. They had to give the same tale of bricks. So obviously they were fed, they were given water, they were given some kind of break. They were conditioned. Suddenly they
Yep.
don't know what to do with this freedom. It is scary.
right, it is scary.
Agreed.
This is, the a modern parallel for this. I remember talking to some Russians who had lived through the fall of the Soviet Union, and
Right.
this was a very similar thing because they were like, it
Mm-hmm.
was very disconcerting
Mm-hmm.
when you have a lifelong communist who
Mm-hmm.
says, "Okay, I'm free. What do I do now?"
Right.
Yep.
Well, you have to look for a job. Well, what's a job? What do you mean? How do I
That's
look
right.
for a job? Well, you have to look for the want ads in the newspaper. What is a want ad?
True.
Yep.
Where does that come from? Who is this person? What do they? What do I say? What do I do? Before they were used to being given a job, you're assigned to
True.
work in this place, and that's
Yep.
it.
So we get past this stage. We're in fifth Aliyah now,
the whole thing.
And
And
God,
so they blamed Moses. Again, they went to Moses. And so now they're falling into a pattern almost of like idolatry, where
No, they are used to the taskmaster.
yeah,
They
that's
are used
right.
to a taskmaster. So to them, they don't go beyond him. He is a taskmaster. They just came out of slavery. It's too big. It's like a child when he is his first steps. He is terrified to go beyond 5 steps or something. We have to hold out our hands, come, and we become their safety.
Yeah. We lost you for a second there,
yeah,
Sam.
I lost her right for a second.
It's all right.
And
Let's move on to we've got a few minutes left. I want to talk about the manna, the manna that comes down. That's a big deal here. This is their food, their sustenance. It's the white, scaly stuff on the ground every morning that supposedly can taste and like anything they want or crave. Yeah,
right,
it
that's the
talks about
tradition.
this like a wafer dipped in honey.
Mm-hmm.
Right, that's a tradition, but in the Torah it says that it tasted like wafers dipped in honey. So it assigns a specific taste to the manna. And the most interesting thing that I see about the manna is that they ate this for 40 years.
Mm-hmm.
And so we see that, and we're often told that the 40 years in the desert were kind of a crucible for the people of Israel. It was the time where they really gelled and became a people, and they were given something special. And I'm wondering how much of what they were given, this special thing, how much of it had to do with an enforced diet of the manna for 40 years. What exactly was this manna? We don't know. What was in there? And did this help them to somehow, did this change them in any way? Genetically, physically, mentally, whatever. What effect did this have? Because they had to eat this for 40 years.
Well, is it the only thing they ate? Because they had their cattle and sheep, right?
Right. They had other things, and there were the episodes with the quails where they
I think of it
complained.
as the carb supplement to their meat diet.
Yeah, it could be, but it's, what exactly did this do to them? Because it's awfully interesting. God could have just said, hey, I'm going to give you some bread. Why give them some special food that no one has ever heard of and never saw again, by the way?
Well,
there is a bush in the
to
Sinai.
counteract what you were talking about earlier, how the Israelites are doubting. So God gives them something that they've never seen before, something that's clearly from heaven to hold on to.
Yeah, but they'd already seen miracles and it hadn't made much of a difference. So I get what you're saying. I think maybe that's part of it, but I think there's something more, because why go to this extent? Why create this new food and feed it to them for 40 years? There were people that grew up on this from birth all the way up to
this is a daily
40.
reminder that James is pointing out.
It's true. Absolutely.
Here's food from God. It's above the taskmaster Moses now.
Let us not forget that they are not stationary also. 42 times they are going to travel during those 40 years. Therefore, the conditions were going to change. The topography, the geography, the climate is going to change. The manna was going to be the permanent food that they don't have to worry about.
Right. They couldn't do agriculture.
They are traveling. They have 42. We are going to be told that there are 42 stations.
Right.
During which they are going to travel. So every day, where is the food going to come from? Therefore, the manna is their daily bread, literally. It is their daily bread. Right. This is the assurance that they will lack no food.
Yeah, they couldn't do agriculture, right? Because they were moving. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, this is a good time to wrap up. So I'm going to pose one question to wrap it up. What was the significant? Remember, they couldn't hoard the manna. They couldn't keep it, they couldn't overstock on it. You only ate your daily bread per se, right?
Mhm.
Why on the Sabbath, on the seventh day, were they told you do not go out and get any? There won't be any. It'll spoil if you take too much. Why on Friday? We're assuming Friday, right? Yom
It
Shishi.
is.
Yeah.
They get two portions,
Mhm.
and one's for the following day for Shabbat.
To condition them, to prepare them to receive the actual commandment of Shabbat.
I
good.
agree with you.
Right.
Very
And
good.
which does this mean that they were not observing Shabbat when they were in Egypt?
Well,
I doubt it.
Shabbat doesn't come
It
into
doesn't
play
exist.
until Sinai.
Exactly. So this was not only the Shabbat, but the Jewish calendar in general. If you remember back before they left Egypt, when Pharaoh finally says, "Okay, you can go," then there's a chapter where it starts with, "This month for you shall be the beginning of months."
Right.
What that means, it is actually possibly the reintroduction of the Jewish calendar back into their lives, because it's highly likely that as slaves they were now under the Egyptian calendar, and they no longer knew what the Jewish calendar was. So you have to introduce the calendar, then you can introduce Shabbat and the holidays afterwards.
Very good.
Yeah.
Well, guess what follows this? Rafa, go on. Sorry, one more comment.
Oh, yeah. I was gonna say, Chazal say that Shabbat is about trust as well. So, even if he gave them a double portion, for them to still go out to go get more, to try to go get more, means that they felt like they would need more throughout the weekend instead of just getting what they need. But if we see the sabbatical years, for instance, as well, all that's about trust for an agrarian society like that, where you have to go out and gather.
Right. It's
Yeah.
trust and
Very
recognition that it is Hashem who provides and not the might of your hand.
That's
Mhm.
right. And you know what comes next? You'll have to stay tuned and come back for the next episode.
Bezat Hashem.
So thank you everybody for joining us on this week's Sephardic U Presents, as we discussed and had another lively conversation about Parashat Beshalach, crossing the Red Sea. Thank you to my co-host, Sam Bendayan. I'm Nathaniel Poole,
Pleasure.
and we'll see you next time.
Amen. Shabbat.
Shabbat tov.